Thanks everybody for joining us for the panel today. We have a great group here. We're going to talk about centering variability and feedback to improve and maintain what this group has been calling human skills, or what you might think of as like 21st century or durable skills. So I'm just going to do a little framing before I introduce our speakers, um, with just sort of the idea that we really need to think about what it means to learn to be human in the age of AI. And like as AI starts doing more and more, really think about what skills do we as humans think are important to have as humans, and also how do we think about helping folks get those skills. Um, and again, we're using this term human skills, but sort of like a lot of different terms for these, from 21st century skills, durable skills, soft skills, but we think of these as really human skills. And we know that the demand for these skills, so things like communication, collaboration, critical thinking, there's a lot of narratives about how this is really intensified in the sort of post-generative AI era. And I would argue that there's like essentially universal agreement on the fact that these skills are important. We know that this from like education, from workforce. We would all say these things are skills that we want to have, but it's really hard to integrate and develop and especially assess these skills effectively to help learners improve these skills. And in particular, sort of traditional education models often treats these as like decontextualized traits, like, okay, this person is a good communicator or a good collaborator. And we assess them in some way that sort of treat them relatively static, rather than thinking about them as really these emergent developmental, and what we'll talk about today is really the idea that they're really context dependent capacities too, that we need to think about how they are evolving across multiple spaces. And on top of that, the interventions for them tend to be really time limited, relatively standardized, kind of in a one size fits all model, really prioritizing generalizability over helping an individual. So I'll just say that the three folks who are going to talk today have been doing some really awesome thinking about this, and some of the work that we've been working on will be presented today. So hopefully, what we'll do is I'll start by introing our panelists, and they're effectively going to give like a three-person kind of mini like lightning talk, where each of them will take a little bit of time and talk about different aspects of the work, and then we'll open it up for hopefully a great discussion at the end. So just as a brief introduction, the speakers will actually go without stopping, so I'll just go ahead and introduce all of them at once. The first speaker will be Tanya Gamby, who is currently Chief of Wellness at Matter in Space. She's also a licensed clinical psychologist, so like, really interesting perspectives here, and also is owner and founder of a autism clinic in Hawaii. Next, we'll have Laura Allen, who is an associate professor at the University of Minnesota, who does really awesome work thinking about computational linguistics, among many other things. And then David Kill, who is the CEO of CML Insights, who's just a wizard data scientist and really fun to work with. So with that, I'm going to let Tanya take it over and sort of help reframe the problem in a little bit more of a specific and interesting way, and then pass it to Laura to think about some of the models we might think about to do this, and then Dave to think about what is the actual computational strategies that we would enact some of these ideas. So Tanya, whenever you're ready.
Yeah, thanks, Caitlin. So this has been as Caitlin said, all of us have been working on this project that I think has been a really interesting intersection of all of our backgrounds and disciplines. And it's sort of, when you bring in all of these different ways of approaching something, and then AI has really augmented our ability to look at solving some of these problems that I think have been difficult to scale in other settings. So I come from a clinical background, like Caitlin mentioned, and an autism background, where we're really teaching soft skills a lot of times with a human in the loop. I'm the human in the loop, and you're changing and modifying and collecting data, particularly in the early intervention world. So some of the thinking that I brought to this project really came from how you apply some of this and how you develop it over time, and then how can we put that into the tech world, and how can we use AI to augment it? And as a team, it's been really interesting to put our thinking together. So we'll run through some of the ways that we've been thinking about this, which I think one of the pieces that's been missing a lot of times when you teach soft skills in any context is how dynamic, developmental, and relational they are. Like you really can't even quantify them as a one size fits all. You can't say, well, this person's leadership is great. Leadership where? Leadership for whom? Leadership in what context? What dimensions of leadership? And I think sometimes when you really see in real life somebody who's actually a good leader, you may find that they're humor augments their disorganization or that we've got a strength and weakness profile that many times is hard to quantify by some of these traditional measures. And you really need repeated measures and many different measures to get at more of a ground truth. So looking at the problem, they're dynamic, they're developmental, they take time. So many times you'll see a boot camp or you'll see somebody, it's a kind of one size fits all class that we try to teach these in. And that's not the way they are developed. They're developed over time, instrumentally. They're variable and they're deeply contextual. So you may be a great leader in one context, and when you move into another organization, really find that it's lacking, that the norms or the expectations are different. So you sort of need this bi-directional, generalizable model that can change over time and change with the individual's new needs, cultural needs, and independent needs. We can go to the next slide. If you look at adjacent fields, which is where I come from, and if you look at maybe medicine, for example, and really with this move into precision medicine, we're taking a lot of population level statistics. We know what antibiotic tends to work well, right? We know what treatment regimen tends to work well, but what you see physicians do is they then look at the patient and they say, well, for this patient in particular and their complex needs, what would this patient actually need? And then they're actually looking at data, and over time they're modifying their treatment plan based on whether the patient is responding to the treatment intervention that they're using. So you see this back and forth between patient and doctor that optimizes treatment outcomes, and particularly as we get more data, you're able to optimize those treatment interventions at a higher level of specificity. We see the same thing in any of you are familiar with early intervention autism. You have hundreds and hundreds of data points that you're working on for each child, and there's lots of strategies you could use. And you're using the strategy, deciding if it's working, changing strategies if it's not working, operationalizing these skills that you're trying to change, and then looking at the child in context. This child, because of their home situation, needs a different set of skills, and so we work on something entirely different. So it's a really fluid back and forth. You see that in athletic coaching. You see it, they may say we want to improve this runner's outcome or their how quickly they can run. They may try a lot of different strategies, and they really are using the data, the endpoint data, to decide whether they're successful or not, rather than a pre-identified structure. And I think that that's actually a pretty key difference. In other disciplines, we really see that the outcome is the target. What is the goal that you're trying to do? And I think one of the difficulties with soft skills is that goal's really fluid. You can't say leadership is one thing. Leadership is one thing in one place and one time for one person. It's many different things. And many times I think in education you see that the content is the target. So there's a structured content that people are trying to deliver with fidelity. So kind of borrowing from some of these other fields where there's an outcome, many different routes that you can take it. We've kind of joke and say we're curriculum agnostic. You could basically take any curriculum that has some evidence for it and optimize it based on the data that you're seeing and do this sort of back and forth optimization between what you're seeing in the student and what you're seeing from the data. So what you see in these other fields is you're repeatedly measuring the patient, the student, the learner, and you're looking at whether you're making progress. And if you're not making progress, in crude ways, you change interventions and you kind of go back to the drawing board. So you're really adjusting in real time with a level of fluidity that I think has been difficult to do in educational settings because most of these other interventions I'm talking about, these are a one-to-one intervention. You've got one patient, one therapist, and one client, and that allows the ability to really have some flexibility and use your data to guide the intervention choices. So if we look at, some of what this very model that we're going to be talking about is if you're looking at human skills as developmental skills with a changing trajectory over time, and we look at generative AI and the ability to now have learner profiles and have a much more complex multidimensional ratings of students, we suddenly can start to do what clinicians and doctors have been able to do on a one-to-one level. You can do this real-time analysis, you can get a contextual understanding, you can have the student or learner talk back, explain if something's wrong, and really give back to the learner dynamic feedback at scale. And I'm going to let the other people go into kind of the specifics of how you would do that. And we have these examples where we are really seeing behavior change at scale. I like to say it's the biggest behavior change experiment in the world are these social media platforms of really being able to optimize behaviors in a certain direction. It's changed culture. So if we're taking some of what you're going to hear us talking about is taking a learning from all of these different strategies and backgrounds. And when you look at LLM coaching, as a possibility. And this is really where I think it got really exciting for our team to think about how do you do this? How do you scale that? How do you actually put this into practice? And Google did some really interesting work in one of their papers that they were doing where they were setting an LLM up to be a health expert. And the LLM was given, if you look at the slide, it's told you're a sleep medicine expert. It's given background information, it's given test estimates, it's given outcomes, and it's supposed to give a treatment recommendation. It's supposed to answer questions. And if you go to the next slide, what I think was really interesting about the outcome here is it was actually outperforming, and this is similar to what we're seeing in many medical settings, but it was outperforming the clinicians and the physicians in sleep interventions. And I'm a sleep specialist. It's one of the interventions I do. It's a very formulaic intervention that you do with people, and it's based on math. And you go from at this level of sleep efficiency, so you could see where it would be somewhat easy to translate that into an LLM. But what I thought was interesting is if you tried to hard code some of this stuff, if you tried to say sleep efficiency is less than 60%, so do X, Y, and Z, right? You have a limited number of variables. But what really this model does where you feed this data to an LLM is it's also able to say to the learner, what happened? How come you're not sleeping? And if the learner says, I live in a really noisy household and everyone around me is loud all the time and I can't sleep, well, I'm not going to go back into my sleep intervention. That's an inappropriate intervention. It's actually not matching what's the need right then of the patient. So you can say, wear earplugs, right? Put white noise on. It might be a very different intervention based on that nuance that the patient or the student offers you. We haven't really in online without a teacher in the mix, we haven't been able to scale that level of personalization and that level of intervention. And suddenly not only are we able to do it, but we're really seeing other examples of it happening. I think some of the work that Google's doing in the healthcare space is showing some really interesting interventions of the way, examples of ways to use LLMs where you're bringing in the same type of multifactorial data that you'd be using in soft skills and repeated measures, along with some judgment and some ways to teach these skills. So if you stay on the translation to human skills, I think one of the things that our team has been really playing with is operationalization of these skills doesn't require perfect measurement. I don't know that you actually can perfectly measure leadership. I actually think that's a fallacy to be able to say that. It's so dependent on where you are and who you are and what's happening. I'm just using that, or perfect communication or perfect empathy. They're really switching over time. But what we're suggesting is it takes actionable measurement, that you have to be seeing some sort of measurement that you can take action on and have some signals for where you want to improve, what you want to improve next, what actually means, what demonstrates meaningful change over time. So an example would be, sticking with my leadership example, is it could be it's assessed through influence patterns in group discussions, task coordination behaviors, conflict resolution effectiveness. It could be 360 evals from peers and coworkers. That one I actually think is particularly important because really what you're doing when you include 360 evals is you're getting ground truths from the people these students are actually interacting with, whether that's their bosses or their coworkers. So they could look great in our online forum. And so often in my autism clinic, we see that in our clinic, the kids are looking great. And when we go and generalize to preschools or out into the community, those skills aren't translating. And you go back and you refine and you modify based on the new context and the new needs. So if our data indicated that there was declining peer engagement during collaborative tasks, as measured through some of these different measures, the system can generate an intervention right at that moment, really with its LLM generated. I notice your teammates have been quieter in the last 10 minutes. Try asking Sarah directly what she thinks, then build on her response. In therapy, we call this a bug in the ear, where when you're training therapists, many times you're putting a bug in their ear and you're talking to them and you're coaching them. And actually in our autism clinic, we do that too. We're coaching them through their ear, kind of saying, hey, try this, ask them if they want to play, see if they'd like to do that. So what we've been able to do is if everyone has their own LLM agent, there's this ability to scale some of that coaching in real time when they need it. So that's the overview of what we were trying to do. And I'll pass it over to Laura. So she can talk about some of the specifics and then to Dave into some of the measurement pieces of it.
Thanks, Tanya. So yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit more about our very framework. And so as Tanya did such a great job of describing, a lot of this framework came out of the thinking around how should we as educators think about how to sort of intervene and provide feedback on these human skills. And one of the things that's really interesting about human skills that's very different than the typical, like maybe math or something like that. If you're a math person, don't get mad at me. It's very complex too. But some of these types of skills is that they're so largely dependent on context. And the context here can be something. So if I'm thinking about how my communication skills work, right? So me sort of sending an email to my boss might look completely different than me sending a text to a friend compared to me, talking to my next door neighbor, on our porches, right? And so there's different sorts of ways that things need to be assessed. That means we can't have these one size fits all assessments for all different contexts. And we also need very different interventions based on sort of like where people are doing well and maybe where they're struggling. And so one of those things is that learning systems really need to recognize and support variability at multiple different levels. And so our framework sort of came out of this idea of how we should, I'm not there yet, but of how we should sort of focus on this. And so it has four main dimensions or components. First, it's that variability is the foundation, and I'll sort of talk about what levels we think are important. And then second is that we need to be applying continuous multimodal measurements in order to get this real-time sort of tracking of how people are doing across different contexts. We need layered personalization and micro-adaptation, and then we need feedback-driven development. So I'll start by talking about variability as the foundation. And so this is largely what one of the things that Tanya already talked a lot about, so I'm not going to go into it too much. But the idea here is that a lot of traditional learning systems, because it's been so difficult to model, every single context and every single possible individual difference amongst people and contexts and tasks, then what education has largely done is start to design for the average learner, for the average task. So we sort of say, like, what would a typical person do in this very typical environment? And then we also take out a lot of the nuances that make contextually driven human skills interesting, right? And so if I'm interested in how someone knows how to write, for example, rather than thinking about the fact that they might be writing to their senator because they're civically engaged, or they might be writing to a friend because they want to be empathetic and caring, right? I'm going to sort of like take out all those interesting things and make writing prompts like you see on standardized tests that don't require any sort of perspective taking, any sort of emotion, any sort of anything, so that we can sort of remove all of that interesting contextual variability. And traditionally that has been how we had to do it because we didn't have the sort of like technological capacities to do that. And so we are thinking about the fact that we should model variability at three main levels. So the first level is person, the second is contextual, and the third is intervention. So briefly, at the person level, our framework sort of focuses on the fact that learners differ in a lot of different ways, way beyond the typical ways that we typically measure, like background knowledge and developmental levels. So they vary in their emotions, their motivations, their mental health, their identities, all these different sorts of things. And beyond that, these things are not fixed traits, right? They sort of fluctuate across context, they fluctuate across time, and they influence how students interpret tasks, respond to feedback, sustain engagement, and all these different sorts of context. And so in our framework, these differences shouldn't be treated as noise. They should be sort of things that we're actually modeling because there's the specific mechanism through which the learning actually happens. So the second source of variability that we focus on is context. And so as we've talked about already, human skills don't exist in isolation. They're shaped by the environment and all the sort of different constraints and affordances of specific environments. And so the same person can sort of communicate effectively in different ways across different contexts. And we know from learning sciences that that cognition is situated and distributed. And so what learners know depends on the affordances and the constraints of the environment they're in. And this is why one of the reasons that transfer is so difficult, right? Because skills that appear really good in one setting might not generalize to another without the support that sort of bridges those differences. Um, and then the third source of variability is the variability of the intervention itself. Um, and so interventions that we can provide to students vary in a lot of different ways, right? They can vary in their pacing, their intensity, the scaffolding, modality. I could go on, right? They have a lot of different ways that they sort of can shift. And each approach has different assumptions about how learning happens and works differently depending on learners, the specific learners and the ways that they vary and the way that they are showing up in that context on that day or in that time period. So for example, some sort of real-time feedback could really accelerate learning for some learners, but feel extremely overwhelming in like a high stakes situation. Reflection-based activities might be really good for metacognition in like pretty, chill, low stakes settings, but they might not be effective when learners are really focused on the goal and the task, and it might just sort of feel like a thing that's detracting from their main goals. Even things like group work or peer feedback can help or hinder learning depending on how they're structured. So the point here is that variation in intervention design is not noise. It's the actual signal that we should be using. So it shows how different conditions afford or constrain learning for different people in different ways. So going back to the framework, now we'll talk about continuous multimodal measurement. So we've talked about variability as the foundation, but the next question is how we actually work with that variability in practice. So human skills, like I said, are dynamic and context sensitive. And so what that means is that we cannot be measuring them or assessing them in these one-shot single tests or single observations that are so common in educational contexts. These assessments often sort of flatten the processes that we're trying to understand, whereas the continuous measurements allow us to see how these skills are emerging across different contexts and across different tasks and how they interact with things like emotions and behavior. Um, and so for us, what this means is that this measurement is not just this sort of like static checkpoint that can be sort of updated or provide like a summative score at the end. It's active input to provide inference, adapt, and provide feedback, which we're going to talk about in a minute. And the other part here that's really important is the multimodal nature of the data. So integrating things like clickstream patterns, discourse features, keystrokes, gaze, physiological signals, whatever you have, alongside these more sort of broad indicators of like peer evaluations or real world metrics allow you to have a much more context aware picture of learning. And so the goal that I want to emphasize here is just that we shouldn't be classifying learners just by fixed traits, but modeling state level variation that can guide adaptive support. Okay, so the last two are much shorter, but the third component is thinking about personalization and microadaptation. So this focuses on how the systems actually act on this variability once we can actually measure it. And so traditional personalization in education often relies on fixed learner profiles or ability levels, sort of like this student is a high performer or this student is a low performer. But what we are thinking about is the fact that human skill expression is really dynamic and it's sort of the needs of the learner at any given point in time can change moment to moment depending on their emotional state, recent feedback they've been given, sort of their skill set or the task. And so we're thinking about we should be responding to learners at multiple timescales. So at the sort of macro level, this might mean selecting different types of interventions or supports that align with a learner's sort of like broader patterns of engagement or learning. But at the micro level, it might mean adjusting things like timing or pacing or language in response to immediate indicators of engagement, frustration, difficulty, things like that. Um, so a student who engages is really actively in sort of like asynchronous discussions, but hesitates in live collaborations might need different sorts of like scaffolded instructions over time that sort of eventually fades to allow them to engage more independently. Okay. And then the last element of the framework is, I think, one of the more crucial things, and it's something that I think Tanya has really brought sort of as central to our thinking. And it's really thinking about the role of feedback as the primary driver of learning and change. So in education, a lot of times we think about feedback as sort of like the end thing, right? So you do a task and you try really hard so that you get the score, so that you get a grade, or so that you get some sort of thing at the end of a unit or at the end of a course or something like that. Um, but what we're really thinking about is that feedback is the thing that actually drives learning. And so we can see this really clearly in other fields. So in ABA, as Tanya mentioned earlier, feedback can be used to shape performance through things like immediate specific reinforcement. So you can sort of like praise specific strategies or redirect ones that aren't working really well. We also can see this in things like athletics, right? So if you're, if you have a, I keep saying a student, but like a basketball player who's practicing their shot, right? And the coach is not going to wait until like the end of the week to send them a written report on how they're doing, right? They're going to tell them like, follow through on your release or keep your elbow up or something like that, right? I'm not very good at shooting basketballs, but and then right, and so you can sort of immediately adapt and respond to that. And so there, the timing and the specificity is really, really instructionally powerful because it leads to immediate adaptivity. And so in our framework, we're sort of applying that exact same principle to education and saying that feedback should actually guide adaptivity across time and prompt learners strategically at the specific moments. Um, and so the idea here is that we can sort of, when we're combining this with continuous measurement and specific interventions, that this feedback can sort of be the primary mechanism through which students learn. So I'll turn it over to Dave now to talk a little more about the technical components of this.
All right, thanks, Laura. Could you go to the next one? Hmm. Yeah, that one. Thank you. Oh, this is great. So I've been focusing on N-of-1 trials with real-world evidence, and the main purpose is really understanding what's working at N-of-1. And then we are trying to embed causal reasoning into how these LLM agents work through multi-headed transformers and borrowing some interesting ideas from medicine. My background is in healthcare and medicine, and a lot of ICU modeling based on ICU sensor data. And what I noticed about a lot of impact analysis based on average human effect size is that there is just one metric, one outcomes. But in the real world, you don't get to the primary endpoint in one big step. You have to go through multiple smaller steps at an individual level. So we have to essentially concatenate, let's say, surrogate endpoints with primary endpoints to make sure that we are giving learners guidance in terms of how they are progressing with respect to their end game, which is the primary endpoint, like learning outcomes, completion, and let's say thriving post-graduation. So one of the things that we are really focusing on in terms of constructs. So the first one is not everyone is engageable all times, as you know. So we have to identify what are the opportune moments for engaging learners with the right kind of interventions with predictions on how effective those interventions will be for that particular learner. That's really at the core of what we are building in this particular application. And then once you deliver interventions based on predicted impact, now you can wait a little bit and then see if we are observing desired outcomes so that you can essentially correlate anticipated outcomes with observed outcomes so that you can continuously improve the way that these intentional interventions are designed in a playbook fashion, talking about basketball, football, whatever. And at the same time, what we are trying to do is combine this kind of N-of-1 trial results with real-world evidence along with crowdsourced insights so that, let's say, as you go through different kinds of situations, we have a rough idea in terms of what's going to be effective for you at the particular moment. So that's what we've been building. Next, please. So I talk about real-world evidence, and I mentioned that I come from healthcare and medicine. So we built a lot of evidence-based medicine. And the idea is that there are so many high-quality research papers, RCT, quasi-experimental design, um, you name it. There are so many interesting papers. So the idea here is let's find papers subject on these different areas like LLM therapy impact uh, on improving mental health. And you can find all kinds of interesting papers. And we are extracting information in terms of, okay, what was the treatment? What was the population characteristic? What was the N? And how was the experiment designed? What were the outcome metrics, effect size, confidence interval, and so on and so forth? And if you now read the paper is right there. So the idea here is in the case of a cold start problem, you don't know where to start, but at least by working with subject matter experts as well as these research papers, let's come up with the baseline. And then we can improve upon the baseline through conducting prospective trials based on what is already likely to be highly effective. And then we know that there's a lot of variability at the individual level. That's why ATE is never a good thing to try in this type of a causal experiments. So we have to have a starting point using RWE and subject matter experts' ideas. So that's how we start. And then if you go to the next page, so I mentioned this frequently in that this is really the best data footprint that I've ever seen in my career. And I process all kinds of LMS data, SIS data, and then healthcare sensor data. But we are doing something truly differentiated. So here, the idea is that this is the learner life cycle. They get the invitation to download the application and then they register their IoT devices, and then they go through Tanya's intake process. So a lot of interesting surveys to understand, what their psychometric attributes are, along with their mental health situations. And then they go through dialogic learning process using a lot of interesting agents designed to perform didactic dialogic learning, role play, and applying what you just learned to real world situations that are highly personalized to your profession and your job description. So we have all kinds of interesting stuff in terms of how learners engage with different agents teaching different areas, including human skills, going through the curriculum graph stored in AWS Neptune. So that's really dialogic learning. And then this is still being built, but group activities in terms of 360-degree review, social network interactions, and generalized communication skills infer from their group dynamics. So a lot of interesting stuff we can do through group activities. And then, of course, there are wellness activities, and we have IoT data sync. So we have all of these interesting data points we are collecting through these three different major data sources. And then from these data sources, we create dynamic learner profile information as a function of time. And we understand how their behaviors, their level of engagement, their progression, as well as their understanding level, they are changing as a function of time as they navigate through curriculum graph through different agents, including learning and wellness agents. And then from all of these data points, we build predictive models. And basically, we are trying to understand how high value KPIs will be like in the future based on their past and current patterns of behavior and engagement. And then from this, we identify, hey, these are opportune moments for engaging with learners for these reasons. Those are prescriptive models. And then we conduct N-of-1 trials by delivering interventions through multiple channels and then measuring outcomes through this type of N-of-1 observation. And then whatever we collect from N-of-1 trials, as well as from high quality research papers, they get to be incorporated into the playbook. So this is a continuously evolving process that we are learning from these kinds of interactions by understanding this is the learner situation context, this is their profile in terms of what they've been doing so far, and this is a trigger, and this is the intentional interventions, either designed through working with wellness agents in LLMs or through SME provide expertise. So we come up with all kinds of interesting interventions, deliver them, measure outcomes, and keep updating what we learn in terms of what's working for which learners at what point in time and why. So these are examples of simple triggers and interventions. The first one is really they've been absent for 2 days. And we did survival analysis. And if they're absent more than 2 days, then the retention rate drops significantly. So we basically select 2 days as our trigger in this context. And then you have a trigger plus learner profile. And then we pass this information to, let's say, a nudge agent, and it'll come up with some interesting interventions. And then based on evidence and research, and then nudge is delivered, let's say in this case, through push notifications. And then we wait for a day to see if the user logs in, and then they resume their learning activities at what levels of engagement. So we can basically construct KPIs in terms of did they log in, what is their time on task, and then what is their engagement level, and how many topics did they complete with what competency. So we can basically collect all this information in response to a particular, let's say, brief intervention, and then start to associate context learner profile intervention with outcomes. The second example is, let's say this is from Tanya. If they had 3 days of poor sleep, and then we see declining focus while they are engaged in learning activities, then we pass all this information with learner profile to an agent, and it'll come up with some interesting interventions designed to influence their sleep in this case. And then through IoT sensors, we can kind of understand, hey, are they sleeping better over the next 2 days? And of course, we have to differentiate if they are sleeping better because they haven't slept well for 3 straight days versus due to this intervention. But those are kinds of nuances that we are working through. And then we measure, okay, did they sleep better? And then is their focus better than before? And then what is the level of dialogic conversation depths with, let's say, didactic or dialogic agents so that we have a rough idea in terms of before and after, and then see if we can attribute any changes to this particular intervention that happened as a result of this particular trigger. So the question is it a little intrusive? So a lot of these things will be highly personalized, and it depends on what is the level of, let's say, guidance that is acceptable to you. I went through a lot of these conversations in the healthcare space, especially in the wellness space, in that we have IoT sensors, we have RWE, and then we are basically, in this case, even using social networks to deliver interventions. So it all depends on how much guidance you are looking for from your friends or through this type of, let's say, AI agents. And for some folks, they don't mind AI agents talking to them about these issues because they think AI agents are objective and they don't really make past judgments based on what you've been through. So it all depends. So everything is all highly configurable. So next question. So the key challenge is this, in that if you look at this map from Cure Together in terms of effective treatments for depression, what's at the top in terms of popularity and effectiveness is exercise. And then when I check clinicaltrials.gov, there are 963 clinical trials to study whether exercise is effective for treating conditions in this case. And what I find interesting is, to me, what's more important is how to get you to become more physically active, or given where you are. I used to run 10K every morning, but that was just too time consuming and inefficient. So I switched from 10K running to high intensity interval training. And I feel much better. And so the question really boils down to we know what's good for you, but people really don't do what's good for them because they want instant gratification and there are so many different obstacles. And I want to give you an example in that when I was back in Silicon Valley, I was working in Sunnyvale and I had a new employee joining the company that I was at. And then he said he wanted to become healthier and lose weight, but he didn't know where to start. So I took him to the company fitness center. At first he said, "Oh no, no, I don't really like, running on treadmill, that kind of stuff." So I said, "Don't worry about it. I'm not gonna make you run." So I basically asked him to walk for 5 minutes on a treadmill, just 5 minutes, and I walked right next to him. So the both of us chatted while walking for 5 minutes, and then after 5 minutes, I asked him to jot down the distance traveled and his heart rate. I did the same. So we compared our numbers, and he found that I walked much farther and my heart rate was lower than his. And interestingly, over the next couple of months, I saw him going down to the company fitness center after lunch and a few times a day. And then a couple of months later, he came to me and he said, "Hey, Dave, I was able to match your numbers." And he said, "I feel much better too." And he did lose some weight too. So the point is, we are trying to construct all these different sort of pathways so that they get to see what they are doing and how what they are doing is impacting KPIs that matter to your success at N of one. And that pathway, showing the pathway through self-awareness, that's a real challenge that we are trying to overcome.
Thanks to all of you for those nice lightning talks. A lot of information there from a few different perspectives. I just want to jump to the question that Bruno had in the chat. Interesting, but isn't a little intrusive, which I think is a super fair question, especially based on some of the examples that we're giving. So I'm wondering if one of you wants to take that, maybe Tanya, I don't know if you have thoughts on that, to think about like how to balance the modeling with effectiveness and sort of like meeting the person where they are in terms of like how much they want versus being intrusive.
Sorry. Yeah, I think that's a really apt question. And the way that it definitely could be really intrusive. I think it depends on how many levels and how many variables you're measuring. I think a big part of it would also be user consent. And one of the ways we've been modeling is this is user data for them. It's really not going back to an institution or back to a higher. We might give aggregate data around overall communication measures, but a lot of the more your sensor data, any of your clinical measures, those are really data that stays private to the user. And I think there can be levels of this. Like we had the ability, I think, in the platform that we're doing, we have a very complex data system. Like Dave was saying, we have this team of experts. So we were able to really do this at a really high tech level where we've got these pretty adaptive profiles and predictive modeling. But a lot of this is really similar to what you might do in an ABA clinic, and we're doing that manually with hundreds of data points. We're actually taking data points on all of these different behaviors. And let's say you're trying to develop friendship behavior in a child, there might be 15 targets at a time. You'd need language, you would need pro-social bids, you would need, a number of different complex behaviors, and you're sort of moving them all forward and you're using interventions. And we're doing that manually, and we're just looking at the data. Is the curve moving in the right direction? Is this child moving in the way? So I really think there's different degrees of complexity that people can bring to this type of learning, different degrees of intrusiveness, with really some of the point being this intersection of variability plus constant feedback plus constant multimodal data points rather than trying to come up with one outcome or one goal is pretty essential, I think, as we think about shaping soft skills in the future, is maybe rethinking about how we're teaching and developing, and the best pathway forward might be a little bit different than the one that's been used historically. And Laura, I don't know if you want to add from a communication lens or have something from your work?
Yeah. I mean, I think everything you said, I mean, I think from the language perspective, like, I mean, I guess like to back up a little bit, I think of like the intrusion at like two different levels, where like we've got the data intrusion and then the intrusion of the actual like feedback and intervention pieces, right? And so I think from the data perspective, like these types of things can be intrusive, but I think what's happening is that so many companies are collecting our data in so many of these ways already. And so what it is that we should have companies that are responsibly doing it, and there should be much more transparency around the models that are sort of doing it and how they're, and I think to Tanya's point, like being more transparent about what kind of data is being collected on you and how it's being used, I think will go a lot further than saying we're not going to collect data, because I think so many people are doing it anyway. And so really saying like we used your data to determine this insight, right? And like this is how it's going to be used, rather than I think what a lot of the sort of like social media and different sorts of companies are doing, where your data is being collected and it's being, sort of like used to adapt your behavior in ways that you don't necessarily know about. And I think that's where it becomes much more nefarious and sort of concerning. And so anyway, I think that part is one of it, is like there's this transparency piece that I think is sort of baked into this idea where you can sort of like, this isn't one of those interventions that only works if you don't know that it's happening, right? You can be extremely transparent with something like this, and I think make it really work. Um, but then in terms of the actual, like, if we mean in terms of the way the feedback actually feels or the intervention feels, like, I mean, in communication, I think it can feel
Mhm.
really similar, where to Tanya's point about like the way that we give feedback about communication is in normal life very directive and very responsive, right? So when I'm learning how to talk or learning how to communicate with someone else, we rely on feedback from whoever we're communicating with immediately, right? Like the way that, I mean, even right now, like I'm talking and people are nodding their heads or they're doing things, and that tells me to keep going or to totally change course about what I'm saying, right? And what has happened is that when we put those things into education, all of a sudden that becomes really difficult to do. And so we've been providing like feedback in a way that is sort of very different than the way that it actually happens in the real world. And so I think in many ways, sort of scaffolding that type of feedback and figuring out how to do it in a way that feels natural, and not like stopping and being like, let's talk through your feedback right now, and like in ways that feel like most primed to provide adaptivity, and is what we should be thinking about. But Dave, you go.
No, I mean, thanks, Laura and Tanya. So I'll share my experience. We take privacy very seriously, and I mean, I process a lot of data, but I don't know whose data I'm processing. But from my perspective, what I experience is that I'm having conversations with, let's say, role play, apply, and wind down agents, sharing my deep thoughts. And I particularly like interactions with, let's say, role play agents because I just learned something. And then basically I'm talking to a customer who wants to, let's say, buy an AI system that has what I just learned as a product feature. And but the customer is not a knowledgeable person. So basically they are asking some interesting sort of nuanced questions from a customer's perspective. And as a data scientist, I have to explain and answer to all these questions. And what I like about that type of learning is that after going through, let's say, 25, 30 tons, for example, I get immediate feedback. And I have a good idea in terms of where I did poorly. And the feedback that I got was consistent with my thinking, oh, gee, I could have improved on in these areas. So I can basically understand where I did poorly and then improve my skills immediately. So those are quite good, from learning perspective. And I don't mind having these kinds of sort of personal conversations with these different agents because they help me improve my skills. And on top of that, I did N of 1 trials with my sleep data. So Robert, great question. So the idea is that we can build causal graphs or predictive models to really understand what are the most important factors that help you sleep better. And those factors can change from person to person. So all of these models need to accommodate these heterogeneities in your population. Uh, so in terms of what contributes to, let's say, poor sleep, so we have to be able to provide those nuances in terms of how you are creating recommendations based on your data, right? So as Tanya mentioned, in my case, what I learned was that if I go to a Japanese restaurant and eat sushi with too much soy sauce, then I don't sleep well because no matter what I do, I have to get up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom. So when I go to Japanese restaurant these days, I try to, enjoy sushi, but not with too much soy sauce. Or try to mix dishes so that I can eat different things as opposed to sushi only or sashimi. So, those are the kinds of nuanced topics that you can learn by having this type of a rich data footprint with all kinds of interesting stuff. And we are processing data in a highly, highly structured manner with user privacy completely respected so that we can provide these kinds of insights to help them improve their skills, thrive post-graduation or at their workplace while improving their wellness. And what I've seen is that wellness is highly correlated with your soft skills because if you're happy, if you're healthy, then you see things in a different light.
And just to add really quick, I want to add to Dave's because I think that's such an interesting example. And Robert, to your question too, that's this, I think, tension between aggregate data and N of one data that I think is really well captured in some of the questions that you're asking. So we can get models on aggregate data. And, back to my example as a clinician, so often when I see people in my clinic, they're really basing they're being told that they're not getting enough sleep and they're panicking. So now we've got a secondary issue of they're anxious and they're trying to sleep more and they're staying in bed longer and they're causing insomnia. It actually is some of these watches are actually really problematic because they're telling you, red alarm, you got a terrible night's sleep. They used to say, go to sleep for much longer, which is actually a terrible suggestion. It's not the way sleep works. But really, when you're working with a client or a patient, you say, how'd you feel today? How'd you do? So often, actually, the person will say, I did fine. I was able to concentrate. I went to work. So I think there's a real tension between, on average, should you get this amount of sleep? Sure. On average, should you do this? Sure. How does it actually impact you in your day-to-day life? And that's some of the sophistication, I think, that we're actually able to do in some of these more complex modeling environments and where you're going to end up one and where you have an LLM who can ask that question. So it looks like you're not sleeping well, but do you need me to shorten the sessions for you? Because you seem like you're doing fine. And if the LLM says I'm fine, or if the student says I'm fine, we're really able to match the need versus prescribe in a way that we used to have to just prescribe because there wasn't this dynamic back and forth that we could do.
Uh, Thanks, Tanya. I want to go. I think we have time for like one more question, and there's one in the Hoover app and one that just got posted in the chat that I think are kind of related to each other. So there's a question about how you actually do the measurement, and I think both of the questions are kind of getting at is like how do you actually do this? And I think I would love for one or more of you to respond to this because I think what you mentioned earlier, Tanya, is that having multiple sources of ground truth is sort of a tenet of this idea. So I would love for one or more of you to kind of talk about, is it numerical scales? Is it a progression where you've met or not met that? Or how do you actually think about having that ground truth and having it from multiple sources so that you're not ending up modeling to something that still feels like overly standardized, if that makes sense?
I mean, I can talk to it a little bit from the clinical world. So if you think about, so I'll go back to some sort of either language behavior or in our younger clinics. A lot of times we're using trial child data, so we're actually looking at how the child's performing. We're using duration. We're using length of utterances. We're using complexity of utterances. Dynamic nature of utterances. So we may have multiple scales depending on what's the outcome. Are we looking at language complexity? Are we looking at pro-social things? And I really think the measurement tool needs to match the question. More than one is better than the other. I think you're picking the tool based on the question you're asking. I think The validated scales give us a grounding. So if I know that by age 4 a child should be speaking like this, I have some sort of grounding to base where I'm teaching this kid. Am I going too far? Am I going too little? So we use some of the ground truths, I think, as a starting point, and then you may see that a child that isn't looking good on one of these scales, when you actually are putting them in the real world, their communication is different than actually what you're measuring. So I know that's a roundabout answer because I don't think there's one answer. I think you start with what's the question you're asking, what's the best ways to measure it, what are the validated ways to measure it, and then as you get more sophisticated, your models are going to get more sophisticated. And I think what Dave was mentioning is you're going to pick out that, for these certain skills we're teaching, these actually ended up being our best measurement tools over time.
Thanks, Tanya. We have a couple more minutes. Laura, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I was just gonna say, I think everything you said, Tanya, is exactly right. And I think the other thing to think about is that I think in education, but also in like almost all measurement contexts in general, we conflate the sort of measurements that are underlying our decision making that we sort of internally use versus the measurements that someone actually sees, right? And so just because know this student is a little off track from a typical development or something like that doesn't mean I necessarily give that feedback in that way to someone else, right? And so I think like also being able to think about what kind of measurement we're using and what the goal of it is. And so like when I think about education or like writing, for example, or any sort of communication type thing, um, what we do a lot is really odd. Like where we'll sort of say, you got either we'll sort of give holistic scores on things for writing, which are almost meaningless to anyone because they don't tell you how to change anything, right? Or we sort of give feedback that's sort of like you had this many clauses or this many phrases or something like that, and right, like no one really knows what to do with that, and students like pretty frequently sort of just like ignore that type of feedback. And so versus saying, let me sort of provide metrics to you that you need to internalize and understand whether or not that was your goal. Did you mean to be verbose? Did you mean to be sort of like talk that much? Or did you mean, sort of think about like how the metrics relate to their intent and sort of show how things might be deviating from like their typical or whatever. So anyway, just thinking about that too, of like there's the feedback element of it that's very different than the thing underlying our models.
Awesome. Thanks, Laura. Thanks, Tanya. Thanks, Dave. I think we're at time now. Give time people to switch to the other sessions. So please take a look at Hoova, see what's next. And yeah, thanks. This was fun. Learned a lot and appreciate all of your thoughts.